Hello, you're watching Global Insights, where we speak to experts from around the world on issues making headlines. I'm Oh Young. The war in Ukraine, supply chains, rising energy prices, not to mention trade wars, have created a very complex and uncertain environment in which to operate for many global companies. And we discuss these realities that seem to have settled to become the new normal for markets all around the world, particularly those in East Asia. For the discussion, we invite John Quelch, Dean of Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. Dr. Quelch, it's wonderful to see you again. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I guess the latest sort of hot news right now, I suppose, is that the US imposed export controls on the sales of semiconductor chips to China last month, not only for advanced machinery, but also knowledge from any US citizens, residents, or green card holders. And of course, semiconductor companies all over the world, they rely on the US for design and the final stages of production. So what would these export control measures targeting China really mean for its own semiconductor firms?
So I think that this represents probably the toughest and most comprehensive set of restrictions and controls that the US has imposed on China. The controls not only apply to US exports to China of high-tech chips and manufacturing equipment for high-tech chips, but they also apply to foreign companies that are using US technology in their chips, and they also are under pressure in these controls to obtain licenses from the US in order to export into China, even if they're not exporting from the US. So, of course, it remains to be seen how effective and comprehensive the implementation is of these restrictions. They do limit, of course, the volume of goods, chips, and associated products that US firms who are chip makers like NVIDIA and AMD can sell into China, but they also restrict other foreign manufacturers of chips as well. So there is potentially an endpoint where nationalism is outweighing global trade, and the availability and pricing of all products that involve these high-end chips could potentially be affected by these restrictions.
Right, and over here in this part of the world, big chip companies like Samsung and TSMC, they're really quite nervous about these constant stream of export control and sort of trade measures that the US, the Biden administration keeps producing, particularly as we are allied countries. But how will this affect companies like Samsung and TSMC, for example?
So I think we see the effects already. In as much as TSMC, for example, is building a $12 billion plant in Arizona, and Samsung is committed to building a $17 billion chip plant in Texas. So what we're seeing is the US customers of these companies are putting pressure on them to bring the supply chain closer to the end customer, i.e. in the US. And the bottom line here is, I think, that we're seeing pressure being placed on these companies to decide whether or not their future is with the West or with China. And of course, that puts these companies in a very difficult and uncomfortable position. At the same time, it should be said that the controls that we're talking about do permit applications for licenses or waivers for foreign companies that are using US technology, chip technology, in manufacturing in their own plants in China. So there is an opportunity for a waiver to be granted. I think SK Hynix, for example, has already received such a waiver. but they're going to be, I think, few and far between. And it remains to be seen whether or not these very tough controls are enough to actually get China to the negotiating table. Finally, perhaps China will see enough of a squeeze here that it will want to step forward and perhaps have a discussion with the US about resolving the trade issues that are still very much outstanding.
Well, the relationship between the US and China seems to be getting more and more bitter by the day. And well, do these new restrictions really indicate that Washington and Beijing, they're going to continue to, well, their economies will continue to bifurcate? Do you actually see global companies leaving the Chinese economy, or do you think they're just going to make some adjustments here and there?
Well, the size of the Chinese market is so substantial that it's very difficult for US companies to forego the Chinese market. But it seems at the moment that geopolitical considerations are trumping trade considerations, and that is promoting this move towards decoupling. Remember that this is one of the few areas, i.e. high-end chips. It's one of the few areas where the US has a substantial and definitive lead over Chinese technology. And therefore, it is a point of leverage that the US feels that currently it can use to squeeze China. Obviously, Beijing is trying to catch up as quickly as possible with US technology, but there's a lot of investment going into US technology in the chip space to keep the Americans ahead. So Beijing and China still several years behind the US in terms of chip technology, not in terms of low-end chips, but in terms of leading-edge chips. And so the US is leveraging this in order to try to get some momentum towards getting concessions from China on the trade issues that we have been talking about for almost a decade.
And also, Professor Quelch, really wanted to hear your take on the recent news we've been hearing from China there after their National Party Congress that took place in the middle of last month. Xi Jinping, he extended his term by a third term, an unprecedented term for Chinese presidents or leaders since Mao Zedong. And well, some believe that he's no longer going to focus on economic growth, but he's going to embark on more domestic and social initiatives. So what are your thoughts on this? Do you think the days of seeing big growth, 8% GDP growth a year are well and truly over?
It's always been clear that the Chinese economy has to pivot from being a manufacturing and export-led economy to more emphasis on domestic consumption. And President Xi's repeated statements regarding the circular economy, in other words, the notion of a more self-contained Chinese economy, are very important to underscore here. China would like to be self-sufficient in many respects, and it has the market size to facilitate the scale of production that enables self-sufficiency. Now, China at the same time is not self-sufficient in energy or food or minerals, but China has, of course, done a very aggressive job of cementing relationships with various emerging economies where it can source those things that it needs for its population. The one other thing I would say is that, look, you simply cannot sustain 8% growth year on year as your economic base grows to the extent that it's grown in China. It's inevitable that the pace of growth has to moderate and will moderate. And of course, there is some concern, and there has been concern, that if the rate of growth slows considerably and prosperity does not improve at the same pace as previously, that Chinese people may become a little more concerned about the government that is in charge. And therefore, President Xi is focusing on bolstering social programs in China that will facilitate better education for the masses, better healthcare for the masses, and so forth. Because the economic growth to keep everyone happy will simply not be there at the same pace that it has been historically.
And well, just to expand on that further, if I could just throw an additional question there, Dr. Quelch. Well, China during the years of Mr. Xi's predecessors, like Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao, they all pursued sort of opening up policies and allowed a little more they loosened control over provincial governments, perhaps, just to allow for more business and just for more innovation to really blossom. But many are concerned that he's going to increase control over, well, basically all parts of society, the economy, and well, what do you think that really spells out for the Chinese economy in terms of, the sort of innovation that we've seen in the last 20 years or so?
Yes, well, I myself happen to be living in China during the era of President Hu Jintao, and it was a very pleasurable time to be in China because, as you say, there was a lot of business activity, a lot of entrepreneurship. It was a fast-growing, freewheeling era. But at the same time, from the point of view of the party, it was potentially unraveling in terms of control. And yes, we have seen, as you know, multiple instances now where Chinese entrepreneurs who perhaps became a little more famous than was good for them were reined in, summarily reined in by the Chinese regime. And this cannot be encouraging for Chinese growth and development if you're suppressing entrepreneurship and initiative. On the other hand, it is the case that there is a formidable arsenal of talent and capability in China that can be put to good work in terms of innovative enterprise, and even within some state-owned companies, there is that level of innovation. So it's a trade-off. I think President Xi does not, in his mind, need so many freewheeling business people and entrepreneurs as perhaps was thought to be fashionable 8 to 10 years ago. And so I think, he's clamping down, but he's sustaining a sufficient level of growth in his mind to keep people happy.
And Dr. Quelch, before we go now, the strong US dollar, that's made fighting inflation harder for many countries here in Korea as well, as it's weakened their currencies. And well, what risks do Asian countries face, and do you see further trouble ahead?
Of course, the U.S. rate hike today, another 75 basis points. I think the markets anticipated it, and they're probably also anticipating another 50 basis points next time and 25 basis points thereafter. That's what the markets in the U.S. have baked in terms of assumptions. Now, as far as Asia is concerned, of course, the fight against inflation requires the Fed to raise these interest rates, and raising the interest rates, of course, strengthens the US dollar and puts pressure on other central banks to raise their rates as well to avoid currency outflows. But the difficulty for Asian economies such as Korea, for example, is that raising rates in sympathy with the U.S. Will perhaps cause a level of downturn in Korea that would be very, very difficult to justified politically or economically. And so the Korean Central Bank, I think, like other Asian banks, Japanese central bank as well, faces a dilemma. They need to note the Federal Reserve's rate hikes, but they're probably not in a position to hike rates at the same pace as the Federal Reserve is doing. And so I think this is actually a difficult time for Korean companies. The Korean bond market has been pretty volatile, and inflation and unemployment, of course, are also concerning.
Just very concerning times ahead over here. Many households in fear of, soaring debt. And we all hope there's some sort of loosening or just some hope there in the future. But thank you so much for your time, Dr. John Quelch, Dean of Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. Thank you very much for your time. It was an honor to have you on our program.
And may I just express my personal condolences to the friends and families of those who lost loved ones in Itaewon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Quelch. Thank you very much to our viewers for watching. Global Insight will be back on Friday, South Korea time. Do tune in then, wherever you are in the world. Have a lovely day or evening. Thank you.